So what's postmodernism exactly? And, well, that's a tricky thing, you know. It's like defining existentialism or phenomenology or any of these other philosophical movements. They're great social transformations, and they manifest themselves in many places. And to try to reduce them to a set number of principles is a very difficult thing. It slips out of your hands. And so any attempt to define is also an oversimplification. But nonetheless, we'll proceed with our oversimplification because we have to do that to some degree to think. So postmodernism is an attitude of skepticism, irony towards and rejection of grand narratives. Well, that's a problem. It's grand narratives that hold cultures together. So it's fine if you reject them, and you can also point out that they're narratives, and you can also point out that they're in some sense grand fictions. And I'm an admirer of fiction because fiction can tell you the truth sometimes in a way that fact can't, right? Otherwise we wouldn't read fiction. There would be no such thing as great literature. And so to call something fiction in some sense is not the same as calling it not true. And that's a very important distinction to make. But they reject grand narratives. And that's a problem because it's the grand narratives that unite us. It's certainly narratives that orient us as individuals. It's shared narratives upon which our society is based. And it's grand shared narratives that allow us to exist in peace within those narratives. So to call those into question is no joke. You don't do it trivially. And it's no different, as far as I'm concerned, than playing oppressor-oppressed politics in some sense, because the Marxists, what they were trying to do was call the grand narrative, let's say, of Western liberalism and capitalism into question, and the postmodernists did that under a different guise. Now, there were many factors that led to the rise of postmodernism, and I'll talk about some of the other ones, but there also reject ideologies and universalism, including objective notions of reason. That's a problem. Human nature. That's a problem. Social progress, absolute truth, and objective reality. Well, you know, that's a long list of things to criticize, right? So we got to walk through that again. They criticize the notion of objective reality. Well, you know, objective reality is a very, very complicated thing, and our knowledge of it is approximate at best. But to criticize the idea that it exists in and of itself is to destabilize us at the most fundamental possible level. And I would say that the fact that that destabilization is an inevitable consequence of postmodern thinking is actually the reason for the postmodern thinking, right? Because it's a transformation. And I'm not inventing the idea that postmodernism is a transformation of Marxism. Derrida, who I would say is the lead jester who was running the postmodernist circus, has stated very clearly that his thought was a transformation and development, further development of Marxism. Well, objective notions of reason. Well, unless we share notions of reason, we can't communicate. We reject ideas of human nature. Okay, well, they did that in the communist countries. There's no human nature. Well, what does that mean? It means I can make you into anything I want. That's a big problem. You know, because it also replaces human nature with someone's theory of human nature. And if you think you have a theory of human nature that's as grand as human nature itself, then you're exactly the sort of arrogant totalitarian that's going to produce the kinds of theories that devastated the Soviet Union and China. You just do not know enough. You can't map yourself. You don't know enough about other people. So even if you have a coherent theory of human nature and it's relatively informed, let's say scientifically, it's fragmentary and partial at best. And there's no way that you can predicate an entire political system, a social system on that. You're just too ignorant. So it's a big problem to criticize the idea of human nature, and that's where you get the idea of social constructionism in part two, which is a terrible force that's invading, I would say, invading our culture especially at mid-level bureaucracy level, and certainly in the education system. You know, the idea that all of the elements of our identity are nothing but the consequences of enculturation. I mean, the underlying pathology of that belief is the justification for the people who hold the belief that they have the right to mold human identity in the image that they want to have it molded. So it's like the desire is the precondition for the conclusion. It's a very dangerous thing. So, no such thing as social progress. Well, that's the same thing as the dissolution of the meta-narrative. You know, if we can't agree on what's good, if we can't agree on what we're aiming at, then we're completely fractionated and divided. because it's a shared aim, it's a shared vision that unites people. And I mean that technically, I mean that psychologically. Look, our eyes have evolved so that we can tell where each of us are looking, because the one thing we want to know about all the other primates that surround us is what the hell they're up to. And one of the ways you figure that out is by looking at their eyes, and you see what they're pointing at. And if you're in a society, everyone's eyes are pointing at the same thing. That's what a flag is for, is to indicate a union of purpose. And if there's a union of purpose, then we're all predictable to one another, because we know what everybody's up to, and that's the same as peace. So you fragment that, you allow that to disappear, you criticize it out of existence, and you have an atomized society. And an atomized society is a violent chaos. It's not an anarchic utopia. It's an absolute catastrophe. I mean, you lose that hierarchical organization. You know, hierarchies, which the postmodernists criticize nonstop, hierarchies, speaking biologically, are at least 350 million years old. They're older than trees. Every animal that's evolved, virtually, exists within a hierarchy, because it's the only way that animals can share a domain, a territory, without constantly destroying each other. And so the attack on the idea of hierarchy, you know, in the guise of the patriarchy, which is so absurd that it's an idea that's absurd. You couldn't invent it. If it didn't exist, there's no way you could dream it up. It's an idea that's that absurd, because the hierarchical organization of society is something far older than human beings. It's a basic truth. And to consider that the cause of all human suffering, when in fact it's the cure for much human suffering, is another indication of the actual motives of the people who are putting the theories forward. Tear everything down. Well, then everyone's equal. Everyone's equal when everything's on fire and everyone's starving in the streets. You know, or at least they're equal in all the important ways. So, no absolute truth, no objective reality. Well, that means that there's no way of determining who is right and wrong in an argument. There's no higher authority to appeal to. You know, and even if you're an atheist, a materialist, scientific type, at least you grip the idea of an objective reality that stands outside your theorizing. The postmodernists dispense with all of that. And so there's no way of telling who's right, and there's no way of telling who's wrong. And there's a tremendous anarchic consequence of that. And the previous speaker referred to that as well, as if there's no truth that we all are nested inside, let's say, then there's no communication between people, because there's nothing that can unite us. And that's exactly why the world of the postmodernist neo-Marxist is a Hobbesian nightmare of competing power hierarchies. And that's another thing that's so terrible about their theory, is they're absolutely convinced that all hierarchies are a consequence of power. Now, you know, power is ill-defined, but you might as well just use tyranny, because that's the idea about the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy is a tyrannical hierarchy. And so the idea is that human hierarchies are based on nothing but tyrannical power. They throw out the idea of competence. You know, most non-tyrannical hierarchies are based on competence, not power. You define tyranny as a hierarchy that's based on power and not competence. And you know, the evidence that the hierarchies in the Western world, at least, are predicated on competence is the fact that the damn lights are on, and there isn't rioting in the streets, and the planes stay in the air most of the time, and everything functions. And people, even postmodernists, you know, they're going to look for the best brain surgeon if they happen to have cancer, that they happen to need an operation. They're not going to dispense with the idea of competence when their life hangs in the balance. But when it comes to being able to justify their anarchic tendencies and their desire to tear everything apart, they'll deny the idea of competence altogether. And you know, that's so terrible, it's almost unimaginable, because it destroys the concept of value itself, right? Because to erect a hierarchy of competency is to say, this mode of action is more functionally appropriate, at least. Or you could say better. This mode of action is better than this mode of action. And if you don't have any distinction between modes of action that are better or worse, then you have no direction in your life, right? Because it's the distinction between things in terms of quality that gives direction to your life. And that's what gives meaning, positive meaning to your life. So if you eradicate the competence hierarchy, you blow out the value structure, then no one has anything to aim for. And all there is chaos. You wonder why people are depressed and why they're nihilistic, especially after they go through enough university postmodern training. I mean, if you understand that and you swallow it, then there's no up and there's no down. And, you know, that's another reason why it's so useful to consider the view in Genesis of human suffering. It's intrinsic to the nature of human existence. And if you don't have a positive value to set against that, right, something to struggle for and something to live for, then all you have is the suffering. Well, that's not good, you know. If an animal, if a human being has nothing but suffering, then what's that going to do to them? Well, they get embittered, that's for sure. And that's what happens to people who don't have any meaning in their life. They get embittered, and then they get vengeful, and then they get murderous, and then they get genocidal. It's not a good thing. So Derrida and Foucault and the rest of those French monsters, you know, they defined hierarchy as power, an absolutely pathological sleight of hand. They destroyed the idea of hierarchies of competence by undermining the idea of an objective world. And these things are all linked together. That was a destruction of the idea of competence itself and destruction of the idea of the world. Everything's interpretation. There's no human nature. Everything's socially constructed. And, you know, you see this even in small ways. And they'll be teaching your kids this in elementary school in no time flat, because it's already happening in Canada. So, if it hasn't happened here, it's going to, and it'll be within the next 2 or 3 years. They're starting to teach kids postmodern literary criticism as the initiation into literature appreciation. And if you're a postmodern literary critic, there's no great works, because there's no great. If you say Dostoevsky's great, it's because you're a white supremacist and you've elevated the Caucasian literary figures arbitrarily to support the domination of your own power group. And if you take Dostoevsky apart, you don't look for what the author meant, because there's no author meaning. You look for how the author's works supports the power structure in which he was embedded. And that's all there is to literature. So that's coming along quite nicely. So, according to the new radicals, the Enlightenment-inspired ideas that have previously structured our world, this is a quote, by the way, according to the new radicals, the Enlightenment-inspired ideas that have previously structured our world, especially the legal and academic parts of it, are a fraud perpetrated and perpetuated by white males to consolidate their own power. And those who disagree with that statement are not only blind, but bigoted. The Enlightenment's goal of an objective and reasoned basis for knowledge, merit, truth, justice, and the like is an impossibility. Objectivity, in the sense of standards of judgment that transcend individual perspectives, does not exist. Reason is just another code word for the views of the privileged. The Enlightenment itself merely replaced one socially constructed view of reality with another, mistaking power for knowledge. There is nothing but power. That's from Daniel Farber and Suzanne Sherry, Beyond All Reason. It was quoted in the New York Times. Not but power. Well, then you might think about that one for a minute too, because if you formulate a political doctrine, or let's say an ontological or epistemological doctrine even more deeply, that says there's nothing but power, then what do you do with the people who hypothetically oppose you? Well, obviously, you use force on them, because there's nothing but power. And so if the only reason that they exist and have their positions of privilege is because they've dominated through tyranny and power, you're fully justified in using that force against them. Well, especially if that's all there is. And that is all there is in the postmodern nihilistic Hobbesian nightmare. It's groups of people united by their, well, this is where it gets murky, by their group identity, whatever that is. It's socially constructed when that's convenient. So anyways, there's no individuals, there's just groups, and the groups cannot communicate with one another because there's really no way of engaging in reasoned discourse between groups of disparate origin. That's just part of the overarching white male patriarchy's justification for holding on to their power claims. They've formulated this theory that discourse between different groups is possible to make the system look less tyrannical than it actually is. This is the sort of thing that your kids are being taught in university. So, Identity politics is the division of society into groups which cannot communicate or cooperate. Well, you know, this is a big problem. You think, well, why is this happening exactly? Like, what's going on? Because that's what we're trying to figure out, right? What's going on? Well, I talked to you about Marxism. I talked to you about the worldview that underlies Marxism, which is predicated fundamentally on resentment for differences in the world. And look, we got to take that with a bit of sympathy, you know? It's not like the world is fair. It's tragedy-ridden, it's unfair, and there's malevolence everywhere. Now, that's not surprising to those of you who consider themselves Christian. I mean, that's a basic part of the doctrine. But that doesn't mean it's palatable. I mean, people differ in all sorts of important ways that have non-trivial effects on their life outcome. In fact, they differ in innumerable ways, which is actually part of the technical and methodological problems of postmodernism. I mean, think about the difference. Here's differences. You know, and you might say, well, some of these are your own doing, and maybe they are and maybe they aren't, but a lot of them are, let's say, gifts of God, for lack of a better terminology. One of the biggest differentiators between people with regards to their long-term success, far more important, by the way, than race, is intelligence. Intelligence has a very powerful biological basis. So, you know, it's funny because there's plenty of modern academics who deny the existence of biological intelligence, and I think that's because they like to think that they got to their positions by pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. You know, there's no gratitude in that. They don't think, well, I was given a gift, and it's not like I earned it. It was part of the structure of my being, the given structure of my being. You know, you could have a little humility in the face of that. Well, so people differ by intelligence. They differ by temperament. Some people are extroverted. Some people aren't. Some people are very, very sensitive to negative emotion. Others are very emotionally stable. Some people are compassionate and polite, and some people are disagreeable and competitive. Some people are conscientious and others aren't, and some people are creative. And all of those have major effects on the way that life unfolds. There's accidents of geography. I mean, here we are in the first world. Well, that's a good deal for us, isn't it? Because the infrastructure is in place. There's an arbitrariness to that the existentialists called thrownness. And you can't really attribute that to your own doing. It's something to be grateful for and to recognize. And the same with regards to your positioning in historical time. You want to go back to like the 1400s or the 1300s? It seems unlikely. I mean, people worked, even in the 1890s, they worked so damn hard that modern people can hardly even imagine it, right? I think one day in the life of a frontier pioneer would kill most of us in this room. Or if it didn't kill us, we'd at least wish we were dead. Well, then there's attractiveness. Attractive people do far better in life. And, you know, it's just no joke to be cursed with ugliness. And that's a major differentiator. And, well, the youth have advantages over the old, right? And, I mean, when you're old, maybe you're rich, because actually being old is a pretty good predictor of being rich, as it turns out, given that you've had a whole life to gather up resources. But I suspect it's the rare old rich person who wouldn't trade in all their money for a young body. So it's not exactly obvious who's got the upper hand there. The old person has the fruits of their labor, but the young person has the potential of the future, and you can't buy that. Health, well, you know, everybody knows people who were promising in 6 different ways who basically got cut off at the knees by some, you know, incomprehensibly arbitrary tragedy and cut their life short or produced an excess of suffering. Different sexes have different advantages. You know, women can have children. They can have multiple orgasms. It's not a trivial thing in the entire course of life. You know, men are bigger and stronger, but they die sooner. Women live about 8 years longer. That's actually quite an advantage. Some people are athletic. Other people are weak. Some people are born wealthy. It's better to be born intelligent, by the way. If you're looking at future prediction, it's better to be born intelligent than to be born wealthy, at least in Western societies. Some people have an intact family structure and others don't. Some people have friends, some people don't. And we differ from an educational perspective. Those are major dimensions of difference, right? And they're all really relevant and important, and they have a major impact on how our lives unfold across time. And the consequence of that is massively unequal distribution of socioeconomic resources. Now, that's not the only measure by which life should be assessed. Far from it. And that's another problem that I have with the radical leftists, that even though they're anti-capitalist to the extreme, they are also convinced that money solves all of the world's problems, and that's just not true. There's lots of problems that money makes worse, and certainly many problems that money can't solve.